Hi, today let's learn what is explicit binding in JavaScript. In JavaScript, we can set the execution context of a function to a specific object of our choice based on the requirements. This we can do explicitly. By default, in JavaScript, when we call a method, the scope points to the this reference in the method points to either a global scope or a window scope or based on the where and when it is called. But we can achieve explicit binding using three instance methods of a function. These methods are also called as function prototype methods. And let's these methods are bind, call, apply. Now let's look at these one by one with the examples. Okay, let's start with the first method, bind. Syntax of bind will be bind of this argument, whatever the context you want to pass it and whatever the context you want to bind your method to, and second parameter onwards, this will be the parameters which you want to pass it to your method and what are the parameters your method requires. Okay, let's take an example and try the bind method. Yeah, the thing I want to mention here with the bind, it returns a function. It doesn't invoke the function immediately, but when you call a method with the dot bind statement, it returns a function, and that method or that the function reference which is returned, that you can call later anywhere based on your requirement. And but still wherever it is the wherever the reference is called, but still the method that this in the method will be executed to the will be pointing to the same context whatever you have passed as a first parameter this arc when you try to call the method with a dot bind. Let's take an example. Okay, so now let's define a method, a function, bind from let's take it like binding. Let's check the binding function example. Okay, and the function and let's use the console.log and I try to print the basically this reference so that like we can understand what is this, the keyword this is referring in the method execution. This refers to this. Okay, and for example, as I mentioned, by default this points to the global scope or a window scope or based on the where and when your method is being called. Okay, let's check that and let's try with the bind. First let's check what is the default binding this pointing to. Node explicit. Yeah, so what we did, we just did a print of the console.log of this. So now you can see here it is pointing to your object which is a global object, and by looking at these methods which are available, you can see these are the methods of web API, right? Window object. Yeah, this is a default binding which it works in JavaScript. Now let's call the same method with the binding to a object which we want. For example, now I'm taking one object and it has 10 and some keys. I'm just giving you a small example. And now how can we call this bind this method to this object? Simply, the syntax is very simple. Method name dot bind of and whatever the context which you want to pass. Here in this example, I want to pass it as a bind this method to the context of obj, the object variable which I created here. So this is the syntax, and if you have a parameter, like you can pass it later as a from the second parameter onwards. But now for this method I don't have any parameters required, so I'm just calling this. Now if you try to call, now you call this, you what we say, we assigned or we binded this method with the context of obj, but and as I mentioned, bind returns a function which you have to invoke. Okay, so let's take a variable f function, something like this, and our bind function, something like that, and we have to call this method, we have to invoke this method. Okay, now let's check what would be the output. You can see here we call the same function, but this time we bound to a object context. So when this console.log got executed, when we call this line number 18, and this is pointing to the object which we declared here. You can see in the output A10 and B20. Got my point? And one more thing, generally, like most of the times you might have seen we using bind for a success and failure callbacks. So like before when, like sometimes like we might require these callbacks, success or the error callbacks for the data calls, and these can be executed any in a different file or a different files like a data request files or somewhere. But still, when you're passing the success callbacks and you already bind to the context of your current file, so wherever method gets executed, it still points to the wherever this method is being bound to the object, the context. Yeah, this is a simple example for bind. And yeah, the points to remember is the first parameter will be the context to be passed, and bind will return a function and we have to invoke again. Yes, so now let's look at the second method of function prototype for, so that is call. How the call works, let's take the same function as an example. Now to bind this function to the context of object using the call syntax, and the first thing to know is that call binds the sets the context to whatever you have passed as a first parameter, and it immediately invokes the function, it immediately executes the function. Unlike bind function, you don't need to invoke it later. Okay, so and the syntax will be function name dot call of, and we want to bind it to object here. And maybe let's take another other object, so that like you don't get confused that it is already bind to object, that's why it is printing with even with call or something. So like just for making you more understand, I'll take a different object this time, some object 1, and let's take only C, something like this. Okay, and let's bind to this object 1, and the syntax will be, if the first parameter will be the context to be passed or context which you want to bind your method to, and the second parameter onwards you can pass the parameters which which your method requires. But in this case, like we don't have any parameters required, so I can skip this, but I'm just trying to mention the syntax of the call. Yeah, so and here you don't need to write, it doesn't return any function, just invokes the function execution. So now the expectation will be This will be point to, now the expectation will be, this will be point to object one, the this here. Okay, let's check the, let's execute and check it. Yeah, you can see this is the call statement. When it gets executed, it is pointing to the object one, see it. And this is how the call works. And let's look at the third instance method of the function, apply. We can use it for explicit binding. Yes, apply also works a similar way as call, but the basic difference between apply and call, when it comes to the syntax of the apply, call will take the parameters from the second parameter onwards, as well like individual parameters. But apply, the second parameter will be the an array. It will be the array of parameters which you need for your your function required. Okay, this is the only one syntax between the call and apply. Let's execute the apply. Here we don't require the parameters, so I'm just skipping this part also again, and execute this. See, we can see that apply also in referring that this is context being set to the object which we have passed the object one. And this is how we can achieve explicit binding through these function prototype methods called bind, call, and apply. And the difference between bind and other two methods, call and apply, are bind returns a function which you have to invoke later any point, we can based on the requirement. And call and apply, it sets the context whatever you have passed as the first argument, and it immediately invokes the function, it immediately executes the function basically. So these are the basic differences between bind, call, and apply. And again, the difference between call and apply, call takes the individual parameters from the second argument onwards, but apply takes the second argument as array of parameters. So this is what I want to explain about the explicit binding in JavaScript. I hope this is clear. Thank you.